Hello, and welcome to DarkTrailz, the place where you are guided into mesmerizing stories designed to help you unwind and drift into sleep. Tonight, we are stepping into the quiet, mist-wrapped forests of the Pacific Northwest, where stories drift between the trees and something ancient may still walk the mossy ground. The branches creak overhead. The night is thick with fog. Something moves. Something watches. They call him Bigfoot. But what if the towering, silent figure behind the leaves is not a cryptid or a leftover legend of logging camps? What if, just what if, this hulking being is no monster at all, but an ancestor, a part of us, hidden, unclaimed, and perhaps more human than we ever imagined? You probably won't survive this, at least not without questioning everything you thought you knew. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are at it, post your current location and local time. I love seeing where in the world you are listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You were not planning to be out this late, but somehow the trail drew you onward, like a ribbon unwinding into a forgotten green cathedral. The pine needles under your boots hush each step. The air is a cool balm on your skin. You do not remember why you turned left at that last fork in the trail. It did not feel like a choice, more like an agreement. And so you are here, beneath a sky no longer navy, but pitch. The stars are too shy to shine through the veil of hanging mist. A breeze skates past your cheek, carrying something more than air, something like breath, as if the forest itself just exhaled. That is when you see it. No footsteps, no rustling, just a silhouette. It does not flinch. Neither do you. 7 feet tall, maybe 8. Shoulders like sandstone. Arms long enough to scratch its knees without bending. The creature's eyes. Yes, you can see them. Gleam not red, not yellow, but a knowing shade of brown. Then it is gone. But it left something behind. Not footprints, though they will come later. Not hair, though you will find that too. No, what it left behind was a question. A whisper that tugged at the roots of your belief. What if Bigfoot is not a legend? What if he is kin across the border to the north, not far from Whitehorse in the Yukon? A group of paleontologists is brushing dust from a jawbone that should not exist. It is not part of any current study, not even the focus of the dig. Just a jagged thing caught between rock and ice, wedged beneath the strata that, by rights, should only hold the bones of caribou and glacial rodents. But this mandible has molars, big ones, flat and human-like, but too big, and the wear pattern unnatural, almost as if the teeth had been used to chew bark or bone. They argue over it in whispers over campfires. The team leader, Dr. Cynthia Rollins, insists it is an oversized hominin, a distant cousin of Neanderthals, but her assistant, a 22-year-old doctoral student named Max, swears it looks like the castings he saw once in a Bigfoot museum outside Tacoma. He is laughed off, of course. They all are until the carbon dating comes back. 39,000 years old. And yet, somehow, new. Not in preservation, in design. The root structure is sophisticated. The growth lines in the enamel do not match any species in the genus Homo. A dental anomaly, the report says, but with a nervous little addendum. Further study required to rule out unclassified hominin. Further study, you would think. One of the senior team members emails a photo of the mandible to a retired archaeologist in Edinburgh. That archaeologist, Dr. Lachlan Greaves, replies in less than an hour. I have seen this before, he writes. What follows is a story you won't find in peer-reviewed journals or dry museum exhibits. It is a tale Dr. Greaves heard in 1974 under the influence of a strong Scotch and a stronger Canadian sunset. A tale told to him by a woman of the Nahanni people, who spoke of a time when there were 2 tribes, those who walked the river and those who walked the tree line. The second tribe was never named, only feared. They were not monsters, she said. They were family, but they did not want our huts, our fires, our words. This is not a bedtime story. Not really. It is a breadcrumb trail of bones, whispered memories, and half-forgotten sketches hidden in the back of notebooks. You did not come here to sleep. You came here to remember. As you descend deeper into the tale, something flickers in your peripheral memory. Maybe it is a childhood camping trip where something rustled too steadily for a raccoon. Maybe it is that old photo, blurry and overexposed, your uncle kept in his tackle box. Or maybe it is something in your DNA, a resonance, a recognition, because this story is not just about the forest. It is about you. Out here, the trees are not the only things that grow tall and silent. Stories do too. And if you listen closely, beneath the hush of leaves, you might hear them rise. The breeze carries something again. This time it smells like wet stone and fur. But fainter. You pause. Somewhere an owl hoots, then cuts off mid-call. Not fear. Respect. The forest is shifting. Not toward danger. Toward memory. You wonder, what else have we mistaken for myth? What truth did we lose when we paved our trails and lit our towns? Because the creature that watched you was not hiding. It was waiting for you to follow. The fossil is locked behind reinforced glass now. Room 42B at the Royal Museum of Anthropology in Toronto. Technically, it is on loan, but everyone knows it is exile. Nobody wants to talk about the jawbone anymore. Not in public. Not after the press release was revised to attribute the find to Pleistocene faunal disturbance. A fancy way of saying raccoons got into the sediment and messed up the layers. But you know that is a lie. You were there when the box was opened. You heard the silence it caused. Not shock, reverence. Like the scientists in that room were standing before something sacred, something older than science, something that should not be classified. Because classification means containment, and this jaw won't be contained. 3 weeks after the Yukon find, Dr. Rollins receives a package wrapped in oilcloth and paranoia. No return address, just a stamp from Washington State. Inside, a thick leather-bound journal, yellowed, pages torn at the edges, but intact. The name scratched into the cover with what looks like a claw. Wexley. The style is unmistakable. Ornate loops, Victorian slant. Dr. Rollins remembers reading about a Dr. Percival Wexley during her undergrad years. A fringe explorer from the early 20th century who vanished near the Cascade Range in 1928. Most thought he would gone mad chasing giants through the forests, scribbling notes about anthropoidal relics and pre-Homo sapiens dialects. But here it was, his journal. And page 1 was dated June 3, 1927. The entries are erratic at first. Typical field observations. Flora. Trail conditions. Weather. But by page 16 the tone shifts. Something is following, he writes. Not bear. Not cougar. Walks upright. Watches without blinking. A few pages later. Observed subject collecting pine cones and sorting them by size. Possible primitive counting system. Then, a crude sketch. The figure is enormous, hunched, shaggy. But its eyes are heartbreakingly human. Wexley writes of encountering a female. Describes the way she cradles a dead bird. She wept. Not noise, just tears. You pause, reread that line. How could Wexley know? How could he be sure? But deep inside, you feel it. He is not lying. He is confessing. The journal continues. Wexley stops referring to the creature as it. Begins calling her the other. Then my sister. Then just her. Meanwhile, Dr. Rollins shares the journal with Max, her assistant. He is silent for hours, devouring page after page. Finally, he whispers. He knew. 100 years ago, he knew. Max begins cross-referencing Wexley's locations with modern satellite data. And that is when they find it. A spot deep in the North Cascades, unmarked on any digital map, surrounded by natural rock formations that appear random. Until you zoom out, they form a spiral. Not erosion, not accident, deliberate. Like a signature, they plan an expedition. Quietly, no grants, no press, just 4 of them. Rollins, Max, an old friend named Dell who specializes in pre-modern tool analysis, and a wildlife tracker named Anika. They pack light, Anika insists on using no GPS. If they have stayed hidden this long, she says, it is because they listen better than we do. On day 3 of the hike, they find a tree. Split down the center not by lightning but by hands. Gigantic ones, the bark peeled carefully. Inside the exposed wood are dozens of moss bundles, like nests for mice, but empty, too clean. No droppings, no fur, just folded silence. That night, something circles their camp. It does not growl, doesn't howl, just moves, a pressure in the dark, like being watched by memory itself. In the morning, Max finds a stack of river stones near his tent, balanced vertically, 6 high, one of them warm though the others are cold. They left this while we slept, he murmurs. Anika nods, a greeting, or a warning. Dell examines the stones, finds trace oils that do not match any known mammal, and a single strand of hair, 3 inches long, chestnut, coarse as horsehair. But when tested later, it reveals a mitochondrial DNA sequence that is almost human. One marker off, one tiny twist in the spiral. They return to civilization changed. No proof, no photos, but something deeper, like stepping out of a painting and realizing the colors were real. Max begins mapping known Bigfoot sightings over Wexley's spiral coordinates. Patterns emerge, not random, a network, almost like migratory paths, but for beings who never left. You wonder, why would a species so close to us, so ancient and aware, choose to vanish from our world? Was it fear or was it choice? And what if they never vanished at all? What if they simply stepped aside? Into places we have forgotten how to look. In 2007, a group of Nahanni elders gathered for a winter storytelling ceremony. One of them, a woman in her 80s with cataracts like moonlight, stood to speak. She told of her grandfather, who was taken not by wolves, but by those with the patient steps. She said he returned for winters later. Eyes changed, voice gentler. He never spoke of what he saw, only said, they are not beasts. They are the other half of our silence. Across the continent, in Maine, a forestry worker finds what he believes is a root structure, but it is too regular. Dug down, woven with branches in a dome. He calls it a hut, except it is insulated and lined with animal hides. No fire pit, just small stone tools arranged in a semicircle. None of it made by machine, all of it placed by hand. And when he returns with his supervisor the next day, it is gone. Not dismantled, moved, with nothing left but a single stone. Warm to the touch, you close your eyes, not in fear, but in invitation. What else have we overlooked? What knowledge hums beneath our boots, waiting for someone to pause long enough to hear it? The wind has changed, carries no sound, yet says everything. They were never lost. We just stopped listening. It begins with a disagreement about a skull. Not a dramatic one, just a murmured debate in the hallway of a museum basement where the lighting flickers as though the bulbs themselves are not sure. What is real? The skull in question sits on a foam cradle, tagged incorrectly as Homo heidelbergensis. But the dimensions do not quite add up. The cranial capacity is too high, the brow ridge too low, and the nasal aperture oddly modern. Dr. Anjali Kapoor, a comparative anatomist from Mumbai, is the first to say it aloud. This is not from any known hominin. Her colleagues glance sideways, unsure if she is serious or simply tired. But the next day, she runs the 3D scan, and what it shows breaks the software's classification matrix. The system tries to label it as Homo sapiens, then as pan-troglodytes, then as gorilla. Can't settle, because the algorithm was never taught to expect something in between, or maybe beyond. By the following week, the scans have reached Dr. Rollins, who sits quietly in her office, staring at the overlapping data points from both the mandible and the skull. There is a cruel symmetry to them, as if 2 distant pieces of one puzzle had fallen centuries apart but still recognized each other. She overlays the scans, and for a heartbeat, the screen pulses. Not literally, but something in the image feels alive, breathing. Max enters the room and stops mid-step. You feel that too. right? He asks. She nods. They do not explain further. Meanwhile, the skull becomes a point of contention. A symposium in Zurich refuses to list Kapoor's presentation. A prominent evolutionary biologist from Berlin calls it fringe bait. But late one night, Kapoor receives an email from someone named simply EH. No affiliation, no signature, just 2 sentences. Look into the caves near Kalalau Valley. The ones nobody lists on any trail map. You are closer than you think. 3 months later, she is in Hawaii. The Kalalau Valley is beautiful, yes, but it also feels watched, as if the mountains themselves have eyelids. On day 4, she finds it, a cave entrance half hidden behind a waterfall. Inside, the air is thick with moss and silence, and on the walls, not paintings, not symbols, just dozens of handprints, some small, some huge, all pressed high above human reach, as if those who made them lived not only alongside us, but above us. Literally, she takes photos, but her camera fails. Every image blurs at the edges like heat distortion. Only the sound recorder works, and when she plays it back later, in a clean hotel room under LED light, she hears something between the drips of water. A whisper, just one word, spoken in a tone that carries weight beyond language. Sister. Back on the mainland, the jawbone and the skull have quietly been reclassified. Not publicly, internally, in a secure database shared only among a dozen institutions. The label reads Homo ignotus, the unknown man, but even that does not feel right. Ignorance implies distance. This feels closer, too close. Max, ever the pattern hunter, begins building a timeline. He maps every misclassified fossil, every oversized print, every fragment too quickly dismissed. What emerges is chilling. Every 200 to 400 years, a cluster of anomalies appears. Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, the Caucasus Mountains, Hunan Province, northern Quebec, and they all follow a lunar rhythm, not in myth, in migration. Dr. Rollins attends a conference in Oslo, hoping to find allies. Instead, she finds a folder slipped under her hotel door. No note, just a hand-drawn sketch of a skeleton, unlike any she has ever seen. The caption reads, in spidery German, Der Stummbruder, the mute brother. The term haunts her, not just for its eerie accuracy, but because of what it implies. That the greatest evolutionary split may not have been between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but between those who spoke, and those who chose not to, and maybe that choice was not born of limitation, but of wisdom. You are walking through the forest again. Or perhaps it is a memory. You can't tell anymore. The trees part like theater curtains, and ahead stands a figure, not hostile, not afraid, just present. He does not speak, but you understand him anyway, not with ears, with marrow. Later, researchers will argue over the speechless ancestor theory. Some say the lack of a laryngeal descent means no language. Others counter that vocal silence does not mean cognitive silence. After all, dolphins communicate without chords. Bees dance. Octopuses shift color. Why assume speech is the only proof of thought? And what if this species had something better? What if they moved beyond words into presence? Into knowing without saying. One night in her cluttered study, Kapoor dreams of the cave again. But this time the handprints glow, not from within, but as if reflecting her, mirroring. She wakes with a thought that won't leave. We did not lose them. We were left behind. And suddenly you remember something from long ago. A childhood walk in the woods. You were 5, maybe 6. You thought you saw someone standing still at the edge of the trail. But your parents said it was just a burnt tree stump. You believed them. You should not have. The journal has more entries than anyone first thought. Tucked between folded maps and brittle dried leaves in the back cover lies a hidden folio, bound with sinew. Not thread, not twine, something older. The pages are waxed and smeared with mud but legible. Dr. Rollins deciphers them slowly, methodically. The ink is iron-based. The script hurried but elegant. These are not field notes. They are confessions. Wexley no longer writes like a scientist. He writes like a man trying to make peace with what he has seen. I believe they are the missing, if in our history one line reads, "Not the link, not the cousin, the decision." Elsewhere, they walked away from the fire before it burned them. I stayed. I am smoke now. One entry stands apart, darker than the rest. We made contact. If such a word fits. I did not speak. She did not growl. But she looked through me, and in that gaze, I saw every error of my kind. Another page. She offered no tool, no token. Only her presence. It was enough. The ink changes here, smudged by rain or tears. I named her Sister of Bark, though I doubt she needed naming. You wonder what he meant. Was it metaphor, a fever dream? Or something closer to scripture? Max becomes obsessed with tracking Wexley's movements in the final weeks. His last known coordinates, dated October 8, 1928, are logged near an unmarked trail east of Lake Chelan. The terrain is treacherous. Rock slides, bears, no signal. But still Max goes. He camps for 7 nights, guided only by handwritten maps and instinct. On the 5th night, it rains. On the 6th, he finds footprints in the mud. Not bear, not human, not hoax, deep set, 3 times larger than his own. And on the 7th night, just before dawn, he hears humming. Not human humming, not melodic, just vibration, as if the ground itself was remembering something. He does not run. He does not reach for his phone. He just listens. The sound fades with the rising sun, but something lingers. In his ears, in his chest, like a chord waiting for its final note. Meanwhile, back at the university, Rollins begins digitizing Wexley's maps. One catches her eye. It is labeled in Latin, via silence, the silent path. It overlaps, bizarrely, with several known migratory corridors of early human groups. But there is one problem. This path flows in reverse. Not east to west, not north to south, but outward, as if something walked away from us. Not toward civilization, but away from it, into older, denser lands. She runs it against current ecological data. The path avoids deforested zones, skirts highways, dips into regions where satellite coverage still falters. It is like a shadow migration, moving always behind the light. Kapoor publishes a private paper among trusted colleagues, suggesting that what we have assumed were isolated cryptid sightings may, in fact, be glimpses of a coordinated, intentional network. A species in quiet exile, she calls it. Their silence may not be primitive. It may be strategy. She includes one haunting line. Perhaps the great lie of sapiens is not that we are alone, but that we should be. Skeptics laugh. A few critics attack her credibility. But an anthropologist from Mongolia writes back. His great-grandfather once told stories of those who never raised a voice. In the Altai Mountains, hunters have passed down tales of shaggy figures who watched silently from the slopes, always watching, never intervening, unless fire was involved. You pause. Fire, the oldest symbol of human dominance, of language, of settlement, but also of destruction. What if they chose forests because they feared what we did with flame? Elsewhere in the journal, Wexley recalls a moment under moonlight. She touched the bark of an old cedar, and it glowed faintly, not with light, with memory. I felt it, a warmth, as if the tree remembered her touch from seasons before. I wonder if our cities remember us so kindly. Another entry. She did not understand mirrors, or perhaps she did, and simply disliked what they revealed. You can't help but picture her, tall, silent, draped in scent and shadow, a being who learned long ago to leave no echo. Rollins begins noticing strange correlations. In regions where Bigfoot sightings occur, local birds behave oddly, not in fear, in reverence, nesting closer to the forest floor, less vocal during certain moon phases, as if the wildlife knows, and adapts, and honors. Max returns from the Cascades thinner, quieter, but there is a peace in his step. He won't say what he saw, only that he no longer believes the term cryptid applies. You do not label your elders, he says. You listen. The team reviews the last known photos of Wexley. In one, he is standing at the edge of a clearing, camera in hand, eyes distant. Behind him, half hidden in the brush, something tall looms. For decades, it was dismissed as shadow. Pareidolia. Now, with filters and AI enhancement, the outline becomes undeniable. A head, sloped. A hand, massive. A gaze, patient. Kapoor stares at the enhanced photo for a long time. He was not alone, she says. He never was. And neither are you, because even now, something lingers in the air. Presence. Not malevolent. Not haunting. Just, no. Like the feeling of being watched not out of threat, but out of memory. As if the forest itself is whispering your name. And maybe, just maybe, they still remember it. Far north, deep in the Nahanni Valley where the fog rolls in so thick it is said to swallow voices, there are stories that never made it to textbooks. Not because they lacked truth, but because they carried too much of it. The Dean people call the region the Valley of Headless Men, and while that grim moniker has drawn its share of thrill-seekers, few stay long enough to hear the older stories. The ones whispered between the lines. The ones about the tribe that vanished. Not from death, from decision. In those tales, there is mention of a time when two branches of the people stood together at the edge of civilization. One chose the fire, the other chose the forest. It was not a fight, it was a parting. Elders still speak of those who turned back. Not in shame, in wisdom. They say the ones who walked into the deeper trees did so not because they feared man, but because they remembered something man had forgotten. Harmony, stillness, the ability to live without carving every inch of earth into squares. You remember hearing stories like that once. Maybe around a campfire. Maybe from a neighbor with eyes too old for his age. Stories dismissed as bedtime nonsense. But nonsense does not leave footprints. Nonsense does not weep over birds. Nonsense does not leave behind DNA sequences one marker off from your own. In 1954, a Canadian ranger named Wallace Devins vanished for 12 days in the Nahanni wilds. When he returned, he was barefoot, without his pack, and speaking Dean despite being a native English speaker. He could not explain how, or why, only that he was guided by silence. In his belongings was a stone, smooth, triangular, etched with a pattern resembling a spiral knot. It did not match any known indigenous carvings. A geologist later determined the rock had originated nearly 300 miles away. And yet, no scratch marks, no erosion, as if it had been handed down, or carried gently for generations. Dr. Rollins reads Devon's story in an old logbook buried deep in Yukon archives. Something about it stirs her. She contacts the Dean historian who cataloged the ranger's case. He responds with one sentence. You are not the first to ask, but you may be the first to listen. He tells her of the others. Not monsters, not spirits, but kin, lost siblings, their feet wider, their gait longer, their skin like leather wrapped in fur. He speaks of a rite once performed by Dean youth, standing alone in the forest for 4 days without speaking, waiting to be acknowledged, not by animals, not by people, by them. If they came, you were never the same. If they did not, you were free to forget. Max, driven as ever, tracks down the descendants of Wexley's guides. One lives in a small village south of Yellowknife. She is 96 and nearly blind. But when Max shows her the enhanced photo from Wexley's last expedition, she chuckles softly. He found her, she says. He followed the sister path. Max asks what that means. She shakes her head. It is not a path. It is a choice. Meanwhile, Kapoor compiles every record of lost or delirious explorers in the region. Pattern emerges. They speak of warmth in the cold, light without fire, presence without form. One even describes seeing eyes older than memory. And all of them, every last one, mention silence. The kind of silence that hugs the bones, that presses on the eardrum like snow, that feels alive. Rollins updates her private research notes with a new term, intentional divergence. Not extinction, not failure, a conscious branching away from the violence of Homo sapiens. She begins to wonder, was language our victory, or our downfall the moment we named the world? Did we lose our place in it? You are walking again. The trail ahead splits. One path is clear, marked, lit by sun. The other disappears into ferns and shadow. You pause. Listen. Nothing. But it is not empty, just waiting. You step forward. Not on the marked trail. On the other. Because you have begun to understand something. They did not vanish. They declined to continue. While we built cities, they built memory. While we shouted, they listened. While we made history, they became myth. And myths, after all, are just truths covered in leaves. Back in the archives, Rollins finds a map dated 1812. It has been redrawn several times, but in the margins, an original ink sketch remains. It shows a ring of mountains surrounding a valley labeled South. She cross-references it with Dean oral history and finds a match. The word means those who sat between. Between what? The scholar does not answer. Just smiles. Not where. When. The thought makes her pause. What if these beings have not just avoided us in space? What if they have learned to slip through the thin places in time? Forests, after all, are timeless. 1,000 rings in a single tree. A century whispered in a falling leaf. Rollins begins marking sightings against lunar cycles. Max adds seasonal migration data from caribou herds. Kapoor overlays known magnetic anomalies. A triangle appears. Not equilateral. Organic. Like the outline of something resting just beneath the surface of the land. Not dead. Sleeping. And you, sitting there in the dark, begin to feel it too. Like a hum just outside the range of hearing. Like a memory you never made but somehow recall. As if you once walked with them. Chose not the fire, but the fern. The tribe did not vanish. They waited for us to notice we are the ones who strayed. Long before airports and railroads and copper wires stitched continents together, there were migrations that left no monuments. Just footprints. And sometimes not even that. In 2018, a glaciologist named Thomas Yu uncovered something strange while studying satellite imagery of permafrost melt near Mount Ziza. Not fossils, not relics, just depressions. Deep, rhythmic, too large for any native fauna, too precise to be geological. He dismissed them at first, blamed the image blur on sensor interference. But a local Tahltan elder, when shown the image, simply said, "That is where they passed." When you asked who they were, the elder shrugged. The ones who did not need fire. The pattern of depressions traced a perfect arc southward, across the ice, toward what is now British Columbia. It was not just one set, it was a line, parallel, spaced exactly 2.5 meters apart, as if an entire group had moved together, walking not in chaos, but in procession. Dr. Rollins, upon reviewing Yu's findings, connects them to another anomaly, a series of hollowed birch trees in northern Idaho. Each tree's core had been removed not by rot or insect, but with delicate precision. The inner pulp scraped clean, the bark left intact. One biologist theorized it was bear behavior. Another suggested primitive human foraging. But there were no tool marks, no claw marks, only small piles of smooth stones placed carefully at the roots. Stones that vibrated under certain frequencies. Not loudly, just enough to feel in the palm, as if carrying memory or message. Kapoor dives into mitochondrial lineage charts. She is looking for ghosts, sequences that appear, then vanish, then reappear millennia later in places they should not be. And she finds them, markers present in Upper Paleolithic Europe, absent for 12,000 years. Then faint traces again in 18th century Greenland Inuit remains. The data is erratic, but it whispers one thing. Someone else was walking alongside us, and they did not stop when we thought they did. Max stumbles upon a sailor's logbook dated 1823, found in a maritime museum in Sitka. The captain describes an encounter while moored near Haida Gwaii. Saw figures at the treeline, he writes. Not animals, not savages. Silent as moonlight, hair to the waist, One approached the water, met my gaze. I lowered my weapon. That entry ends with a note. Crew uneasy. Say the island sings at night. Not wind, not waves. In her notes, Rollins begins sketching what she calls the Great Migration that wasn't. A theory that while Homo sapiens pushed outward, spreading across the globe in waves of conquest and fire, another group moved differently. Not faster, not farther, but deeper, choosing forests over plains, choosing to avoid the coasts, always close to water, but never crossing it. As if the sea was not a path, but a boundary. You begin to think of migration differently, not as escape, but as ritual. What if these beings did not move to survive? What if they moved to remain unseen? What if movement itself is how they stay hidden? The spiral patterns keep showing up. In stone piles, in ancient textiles, in cave etchings dismissed as decorative, but always with one distinct feature. A single break in the spiral, as if marking a door. Not metaphorical, a literal passage. Kapoor finds a cave in central Oregon, long sealed by mudslide, now opened by erosion. Inside are overlapping footprints in petrified clay. Some are human, others nearly twice the length. But the stride suggests no limp, no dragging. They walked the same path. Side by side, Max digs deeper into historic weather records. He begins aligning sightings and anomalies with solar cycles, geomagnetic shifts, and something clicks. Every 412 years, there is a lull in sunspot activity. During those periods, certain parts of the northern hemisphere experience atmospheric anomalies, static without storms, night glow without aurora, and during each of those lulls, there is a spike in legends, not just of monsters, but of watchers. Silent ones, furred, tall, always in pairs. Rollins returns to her field notebooks and underlines a phrase from Wexley's journal. She did not travel alone. She echoed. That word sticks with her, echoed, like a shadow that follows not out of mimicry, but out of memory. One night, Kapoor dreams she is standing on a glacier. A figure walks past her, silent, massive, but not threatening. His fur ripples like water. It leaves no prints, but where it walks, the ice glows faintly. She wakes with tears on her cheeks, and a word in her mouth. Not English, not anything known. She writes it down anyway, Lorianeth. Later, a linguist tells her it matches no root, no family, but phonetically, it carries a meaning close to the one who returns. You think back to that map in Wexley's notes. The spiral was not just art. It was itinerary, a record of movement through places not marked on modern maps. Because those places no longer exist above the surface. But maybe they do beneath, or beside. Kapoor sends a message to Rollins and Max. What if they are not migrating anymore? What if they have stopped? What if they are waiting? The question haunts them. Because waiting implies intent, and intent implies knowledge. And knowledge, that is where things become frightening. You step outside, just for a moment. The night air is cool, familiar, but behind it, under it, within it, something ancient breathes. Not a sound, a shift, as if something aware is passing by. Not in front of you, not behind, but beside, always beside. And suddenly you are no longer sure who the migrants are, them, or us. It starts with a hair, not a clump, not a tuft, just one strand, coarse, chestnut, longer than any human's but not quite animal. Max finds it stuck to the edge of a rusted fire tower deep in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. The tower has not been used in decades. The stairs groan like memory. He does not intend to collect anything. He is just there to observe, to breathe, to feel what Wexley might have felt standing in places unsupervised by modern eyes. But the hair is undeniable. It clings to a metal splinter like a bookmark. He pockets it without thinking. Later, under a microscope, the strand reveals strangeness. Human-like cortex, animal-like cuticle, and a medulla structure that does not match anything on record. It is sent to Kapoor's lab. She runs a full DNA panel, and frowns. The mitochondrial DNA is close to human, painfully close, but there is an anomaly, a looping repetition in one sequence. It should not exist. It mirrors certain archaic hominin patterns, except those belong to lineages extinct for 30,000 years. Kapoor submits the sample anonymously to a commercial DNA service. The result returns flagged, not for contamination, but because the system can't place it in any ethnic grouping. It is labeled unclassified, human variant, and then, quietly, the result disappears from the database. A week later, she receives a letter, handwritten, no return address. The message is simple. Some strands should not be unraveled. First, she assumes it is a prank. But inside the envelope is a second hair. Longer, silvery, bound with a sliver of bark. Not just collected, gifted. Rollins and Max meet her in a small library, archive in Spokane. Away from labs, away from systems. They study the silvery hair together. It fluoresces faintly under ultraviolet light. Not glowing, but catching light like it remembers the sun. Max jokes that it looks like something from a unicorn. Kapoor replies softly, no, something older. Meanwhile, the press picks up on a tabloid story out of Missouri. A hunter claims to have found a tangle of hair wrapped around a tree limb 8 feet off the ground. He burns it before testing, says it made his skin feel wrong. But he sketches what he saw. Interlocking strands, coarser than horsehair, colored like dried blood. The article is dismissed by mainstream outlets. But Max finds a photo on the hunter's old blog, and it matches the strand from Gifford Pinchot exactly. Rollins reaches out to a reclusive geneticist. In Finland, Dr. Kaisa Holmström, once ousted for her fringe theories about evolutionary redirection, she has been living in obscurity, studying wolf-dog hybrids in Lapland. When she sees the DNA results, she laughs. They will never accept this, she says, because it means we are not the peak. We are the divergence. She points to the looping anomaly in the mitochondrial chain. You see repetition. I see protection. Code designed to resist degradation. This is not a mutation. It is intention. That word again. Intention. Not accident. Not adaptation. Intention. The three of them sit in silence. Max breaks it. You think they designed their own genome? Holmström shakes her head. No, I think they listened to the forest. And the forest designed it for them. The idea is absurd. And yet, it fits. In regions of dense, untouched forest where sightings have clustered, environmental biologists have long noted strange pockets of resistance, trees that resist bark beetles, streams that remain algae-free despite stagnant flow, animals that avoid certain zones without clear reason, as if some unspoken equilibrium is being maintained. Or guarded. Kapoor cross-references satellite heat maps with trail cam footage from those regions. One image stands out. A deer frozen in mid-step, staring at something just outside the frame. His eyes wide, not in fear, in awe. Behind it, barely visible in the shadow. A shape, upright, immobile, watching, not hunting, just there. You remember something, a camping trip, a sudden feeling, like forgetting your own name for half a second, like a memory brushing past from someone else's dream. What if they have always been close, not hiding, just moving differently, not through space, through knowing when to appear, when to vanish, when to leave just enough behind to make you wonder, never enough to make you sure. Max begins logging every story of the hare, from Appalachian moonshiners to Siberian loggers. The tales are scattered, but each holds a detail. The hare is always found alone, never shed, always stuck to something unnatural, a fence, a window frame, a camera tripod, left perhaps as a warning, or a curiosity. Kapoor believes it is a breadcrumb, a biological whisper, an invitation to see how close the edge really is. Rollins writes late into the night. She titles her paper The Hair Test Hoax. Or not. It will never be published. Not because it lacks evidence, but because it has too much. Evidence that leads in circles. that refuses to resolve, that loops like the anomaly in the genome, as if the answer is not to be found, but to be felt. She closes her laptop, walks outside. The wind brushes her cheek, and for just a second, she smells something impossible. Pine, smoke, and something older. Something like fur warmed by firelight that has never known fire. It takes a linguist to notice what everyone else has missed. Not in a lab, not in a cave, but in the pauses. Dr. Helena Baird studies proto-languages, the sounds before words had form. The raw edges of thought before it conformed to grammar. She is brought in after Kapoor mentions a repeating vibration in some of the audio clips from Kalalau and Nahani. Not voices, not echoes, just something beneath the threshold of structured sound. Baird listens with headphones large enough to muffle the rest of the world. She sits still for hours, then says, "It is not a language. It is a rhythm of decision." The others blink at her. She explains, "It is like a flock turning midair. Not discussed, just done." As if the body heard what the mind never needed to say. She adjusts the audio spectrogram, overlays one clip with another from the Oregon cave. The patterns align. Identical pulses spaced irregularly but with clear internal logic. They do not speak, she whispers. They synchronize. Kapoor begins digging into vocal tract structures of archaic hominins. Neanderthals had the hyoid bone. A good start. Denisovans likely did too. But this new data, the skull with the human-like eyes and the oversized jaw. This hyoid was missing. Not broken. Not lost. Simply never there. And yet, the cranial resonance chambers were massive. Like cathedral domes for sound. Rollins speculates they used chest vibration. Maybe even bone conduction. Sound, yes. But not speech. Not as we know it. Max finds a record from a Jesuit missionary in 1694 who described furry giants who touched their chests and hummed. He assumed it was mimicry, but what if it was not? What if it was conversation? In frequencies we were never built to hear. Meanwhile, stories of the mute giants surface across oral traditions. From Siberian taiga to Patagonian forests, always described as silent, always watching. One Brazilian legend calls them os observadores sem voz, the watchers without voice. But in every story they understand, they respond, they act, and sometimes they save. An Inuit child lost in whiteout conditions is found asleep beside a melted circle in the snow. No tracks, just a faint smell of cedar. A Maori tale speaks of a guardian who never spoke but once pulled a boy from a flooding river then vanished into fog. The common thread is not magic. It is empathy, not mystical, just ancient. Kapoor proposes a theory that perhaps speech itself was a fork in our evolution, a shortcut that cost us something deeper. Rollins nods. Language was our way to bridge the distance. But what if they never had that distance to begin with? Max recalls the owl from the camp. The way it hooted once, then fell silent, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. He wonders if the forest speaks, and if so, whether these beings are simply the ones who never stopped listening to it. You sit still, thinking of the last time you argued. The last time words did nothing. The last time silence said more than speech ever could. What if they never needed lies, never built weapons from words? What if their truth was always felt, never shouted? Baird points to another pattern. In the cave acoustics, there is a consistent note at 52 Hz, known among marine biologists as the loneliest whale frequency, a pitch too high for most whales to hear, a song unreturned. But in this case, keeps repeating, not lonely, just different. Kapoor wonders, what if that frequency was not an accident of biology? What if it is? There's a pitch chosen not to call the world, but to avoid being called. Max begins building a device, not to broadcast, but to receive. A chest plate that picks up micro-vibrations in the earth. He calls it the listener. He wears it during their next hike into Pine Valley. First, nothing, but around midnight, a hum, gentle, repeating, not constant, like breath. It stops the moment he speaks. He tries again the next night. This time he says nothing, just listens. and the hum returns, this time with a second tone. A reply. They stay for 6 nights. The tones continue, then shift. Not louder, closer. Rollins hears them in her spine. Kapoor dreams in rhythm. Baird, in her notes, simply writes, "We are not alone. We never were. We were just too loud to notice. You sit in the dark, heart beating, not in fear, in cadence. You wonder if you have ever been quiet enough to hear the world respond. Not to your voice, but to your presence. Perhaps that is why the forest always felt like a cathedral. Not because it was grand, but because it was listening back. And maybe, just maybe, so were they." The first footprints appear in the thaw, not near a trail or in some inaccessible ravine, but right along the edge of a glacial moraine in southern Alaska. A pair of hikers find them. At first they assume bear, but the spacing is wrong. The depth is too uniform, and the stride length, impossible. Each print is over 16 inches long. 5 toes, no claws, perfect arches, not just big, anatomically correct, like a barefoot human scaled up in precise proportion. The hikers report it to a ranger station. The prints are gone by the time anyone arrives. But one hiker took photos, and more importantly, he measured them, 48 inches from heel to heel. No dragging, no stagger, whatever made them walk smoothly, like it knew how to glide over uneven ice without breaking. Pace. Max hears about the discovery through a message board he follows quietly. Not a conspiracy site, a glaciologist forum. He contacts the original poster. They meet in Anchorage. The hiker hands him a flash drive and says, "I do not want this online, but you need to see it." On the drive are 14 photos and 1 video. The video shows nothing at first, just snow and trees and silence. But then, for a brief second, a shadow crosses between trees, large, fast, upright. The movement is fluid, too quick for its size. Max watches it 20 times, then files it away with a note. Confirms bipedal glacial crossing. He does not tell anyone. Not yet. Rollins is reviewing glacial erosion, patterns along the same corridor. She finds something peculiar, a sequence of shallow depressions spaced evenly across an ancient sediment layer. It is not a trail. It is a trackway, too old to leave organic residue, but the pressure marks suggest weight. Distribution consistent with upright gait. And again, the same stride length. She compares it to a map of ancient migration routes. This trackway does not match human movement. It moves counter to them, upstream, against the flow of known expansion. Kapoor finds a paper from 1931 by a British explorer who claimed to see a line of figures moving single file across a snowfield in Kamchatka. He wrote, "Not men, not beasts, their heads bowed not in cold, but in reverence." No one believed him. He died in obscurity, but his sketches remain, and the feet match. Every 2 centuries, ice recedes, and in its wake, silence breaks, just long enough for someone to glimpse what was never meant to be known. The glacial prints are never consistent. Sometimes large, sometimes smaller, sometimes clustered, sometimes solitary, but always barefoot, always deliberate, never running, like the being, or beings, had nowhere to go but forward. Kapoor starts calling them the walkers. Not Bigfoot, not relics, just the walkers, because whatever else they are, they walk, and walking, unlike hiding or fleeing or chasing, requires commitment. One evening, Max overlays the footprint map on a topographic scan. The route intersects with dozens of freshwater springs, almost as if the walkers chose paths by water memory, places where rivers once flowed, where snow melted into drinkable silence. Rollins suggests they are not migrating for food, but for something deeper, something felt through the ground, vibration, energy, something older than instinct. In her notes, she sketches a theory, echo-navigation, the idea that these beings could be sensing geologic frequencies through their feet, finding paths not by sight, but by resonance, like whales under ice, like elephants through earth. The concept seems wild, until Baird uncovers a detail in Wexley's journal. He writes of walking barefoot for days after watching her remove her coverings and press her soles to a mossy ridge. She listened with her legs, he wrote. I felt nothing. She smiled at that, and moved on. In modern science, it is called vibrotactile sensitivity, and while humans have some capacity for it, it is dulled by shoes, roads, noise. But the walkers, they may never have lost it. You try it once, barefoot in the woods. You close your eyes, feel the cold through your heels, the pulse of roots, the echo of your own stillness, and for a moment, just one heartbeat, you think you feel something move beneath the ground. Not an animal, not danger, just acknowledgement, as if something ancient knew you were trying. Kapoor installs seismic sensors in 3 valleys along the walker path. No plates, no tremors, but there are pulses, rhythmic, soft, regular, always at the same time, just before dawn, like breath. She records them, plays them through headphones. Nothing but static. But when she plays it on a subwoofer, the walls tremble and a vase falls, not cracked, just moved, as if nudged, as if something said, I hear you. The next morning, a footprint appears outside the cabin, just one, facing toward the forest. The heel deeper than the toes, a sign of stillness, then motion, and in that one print, a single pine cone, split exactly in half, clean, as if by fingernail, not violence. Message, the walkers are not avoiding us. They are reminding us that movement does not always mean escape. Sometimes it means presence. And when the ice retreats again, they will walk again, not away, not toward, but with. The mandible fragment goes missing during a private auction in Geneva. It was not supposed to be there. It was not even supposed to exist. But somehow, a piece of the Yukon jaw filed as damaged, beyond analysis reappears, labeled as a Pleistocene oddity. The catalog description is vague. No origin, no provenance, just a blurry photo and dimensions that match perfectly. Kapoor catches the listing 2 days before the sale. By the time she gets in touch with the curator, it is already sold. No buyer information, no trail, only a whisper from the assistant who handled the shipping. A man with a tremor in his right hand, signed for it, spoke no words. Rollins is furious. Max is quiet. Kapoor starts searching antique registries, cross-border customs manifests, and black market paleontology forums. Nothing. Until a message arrives in her inbox. No subject, no text, just a high-resolution scan of the fragment, and a single line embedded in the file name. Still chewing. The scan reveals something the original researchers missed. On the inner surface of the mandible, near where the masseter muscle would anchor, there is a groove. Not natural, not from erosion. It looks like it was worn smooth by repetitive motion. But it is not from chewing food. It is from pressing against something. Something that did not belong inside a mouth. A shard. A reed. Kapoor models the structure and realizes the jaw may have been used not only for eating, but for vibration. The shape resonates when exposed to certain frequencies. A side effect, or a design. Rollins recalls Wexley's line. She hummed through her face. The possibility is absurd. A being that used its own bones as an acoustic chamber. But then, absurdity is often the mask of truth. Max uncovers a forgotten case study from 1912. A trapper in the Bitterroot Range claimed to have been sung at by something behind the pines. He described the sensation not as hearing a sound, but as tasting it in his teeth. Kapoor runs simulations. The jaw fragment, when subjected to a 52 Hz sine wave, vibrates at resonance. Not enough to fracture, just enough to hum. She holds a 3D printed replica in her hands and plays the tone. Her chest tightens. Her vision blurs. Not from pain, from memory, except it is not hers. Rollins tests a different hypothesis. She hypothesizes the groove may have come from tool use, perhaps a ceremonial implement inserted along the jaw. But every model fractures under stress. Every angle fails. Only when the tool is imagined as organic, flexible, like sinew, does the model hold. Perhaps it was not a tool. Perhaps it was an extension of the being, or a gift passed between them, a resonance string, an heirloom hum, one that required mouth, bone, and memory to activate. Baird becomes fascinated with the concept. She begins compiling every global myth involving speaking bones, from the Zulu tale of the bone flute that sings the past, to the Welsh legend of Bendigeidfran whose skull could prophesy, to the Northern European belief that wisdom lives in the jaw of the dead. Always the mandible, always sound, always memory. Max starts calling it the bone of the mandible, not as anatomy, but as legacy. Rollins marks it on the Wexley map. A node, point of convergence, not physical, symbolic, a point where understanding passes not through language, but through vibration. Kapoor notices something else. In Wexley's later pages, his writing style changes. The syntax becomes more rhythmic, repetitive, almost like chant, as if he had begun to think not in words, but in waves. She analyzes sentence intervals and finds pulse patterns, echoing the same spacing as the 52 Hz tones. Did he start to hear them? Or worse, did he begin to echo them? You sit in your room, place your hand on your throat, hum softly, feel the vibration rise through your jaw. Now imagine your skull built to amplify that, not to speak louder, but to speak deeper, into roots, into stone, into memory. You imagine a being who never needed to say I remember, because remembering was in the way they vibrated, the way they touched a tree, the way they pressed their jaw against the earth and waited for the echo to return. And when it did, they knew the land still knew them. The fragment is never recovered, but the scan lives on, the data embedded in Kapoor's hard drive like a whisper. And every now and then, when she boots up her computer, her speakers click once. A soft hum follows, just beneath audibility. Not a glitch, not a fault, just a reminder that some bones still remember how to sing. It begins with a map, not just any map, a Renaissance chart dated 1587, drawn by an obscure Flemish cartographer named Jan Vrijlink, depicting the eastern coast of what would one day be called North America. The map is beautiful, decorative, gold leaf edging, stylized sea monsters, but tucked in the upper right corner, away from the trade routes and port symbols. There is a curious little marking labeled Norumbega. Not a city, not a nation, a cluster of towers drawn in ink so faint it nearly disappears into the parchment. For centuries, scholars debated whether Norumbega was a myth, a cartographic mistake, or a lost European outpost. But to Rollins, the name stands out. Wexley referenced it once in his journal. A side note, spoke to a trapper near the Great Woods who insists he descended from the builders of Norumbega, said they did not need roads because they remembered. That word again, remembered, not navigated, not calculated, remembered. Kapoor finds a high-resolution scan of the map held in a Swedish archive. She overlays it with modern satellite imagery. The proportions are off, but the tower cluster aligns with an area in Maine known for legends of ghost villages and earth hums. Max digs deeper. The same location was part of a 1700s land grant, later revoked because surveyors refused to finish their work. Their journals mentioned difficult terrain and an unsettling presence. No concrete explanations, just gaps. He finds a field sketch from 1732 showing a series of standing stones in a spiral arrangement. The caption reads, Watcher's Court. Rollins sends the images to Baird, who immediately notes the arrangement's acoustics would amplify low-frequency resonance while muting high-pitched sounds. In other words, perfect for subsonic communication, not performance, presence. Kapoor and Max drive to Maine. They hike to the coordinates, now overgrown with pine and birch. No trail markers, just old root systems like veins beneath the soil. After 2 hours, they find it. Not the towers, but their shadows, impressions in the stone, foundations carved by hands that understood the land as part of their architecture. There are no walls, No roofs, just remnants shaped like ribs, circling a center hollow as if a heart once beat there. At the center is a stone bowl, large, smooth, no markings, just a single spiral etched shallow along the edge. Not decorative, instructional. Kapoor hums gently beside it. The bowl responds, a low vibration she feels in her calves. Not sound, presence. They stay until nightfall. The air cools, the trees shift. No animals make noise, but there is a sensation, not fear, not even awareness, permission. That night they camp nearby. At 1 a.m. the ground vibrates. Briefly, like a memory exhaling. Max records nothing. But in the morning, there is a pinecone balanced atop the stone bowl. Split, clean, familiar. When they return, Rollins pieces together the last known references to Norumbega. In a letter from a French priest who traveled New England in the 1600s, he writes, I found no city, only the suggestion of one. The forest itself seems to hold its shape. Another letter, and signed, dated 1631, reads, They said the old ones lived in towers of no stone, that when they walked away, the towers walked with them. Baird believes the cartographers did not invent Norumbega. They caught glimpses of something shifting, something that did not stay still long enough to be named. Rollins wonders if the towers were not buildings at all, but beings, standing tall, waiting, remembered only as structures because that is how Europeans knew to label permanence. Kapoor writes in her notes, they did not build the land, they became part of it. Max starts referring to Norumbega as the Echo City, not made of stone or brick, but of resonance, formed wherever they paused long enough to let the memory settle into the roots. Not a city in space, but in time, repeating like a melody played in intervals. You think of cities now. Noise, light, concrete. You wonder what it would mean to live in a place that sang rather than shouted, that listened rather than glowed. You wonder what remains beneath your own hometown. Not in the ground, in the silence between traffic lights, in the forgotten hum behind the power lines. Perhaps Norumbega was not a myth. Perhaps it was just too still to be seen, too quiet to be recorded, too alive to be destroyed. And perhaps somewhere in the woods, if you hum the right note and stand perfectly still, the towers will rise again. Not in stone, in memory. It begins with a scream, not the kind born from fear or pain, but something deeper, wilder, a sound that does not end with the breath, but carries through the trees like a ripple through water. It is heard by campers at Lake Cowlock, a glacial basin tucked into a forgotten corner of the Olympic Peninsula. The area is off-grid, remote even by Washington standards, and popular only with backpackers who prefer silence to scenery. On the second night of their trip, just past midnight, the campers hear the scream again. It comes from the ridge. Not a roar, not a howl. A long, low note that rises like a question no one dares answer. One camper, a former sound technician, records it. When analyzed later, the waveform is unlike any terrestrial animal. The harmonic structure is not natural. It contains microtonal fluctuations found only in human vocalizations and certain experimental instruments. The frequency hovers near 52 Hz. Max and Kapoor listen to the clip in stunned silence. Baird listens too, eyes closed, and says, It is not a warning. It is morning. The next morning, the campers find strange marks on the trees. Not scratches, not carvings, just the bark pulled back in wide, gentle strips, as if peeled by a giant thumb. On one tree, sap has hardened into an intricate web, glinting in the light like crystal veins. Nearby, a patch of moss has been removed completely, revealing a ring of stones underneath. Each stone is different, polished, as if chosen. Rollins recognizes the formation from Wexley's notes. He called it a listening circle, a place to sit in silence until the forest answered back. The campers leave early. One of them never speaks of the trip again. Another reports strange dreams for weeks, always of eyes, not glowing, just present. Kapoor travels to Lake Kalak with Max 2 weeks later. They hike the ridge at dusk. The wind carries nothing. No birds, no insects, just stillness. At the top, they find the peeled tree, and at its base, hair, coarse, chestnut, twisted around a stone. Max pockets it without speaking. That night, they set up camp but do not light a fire. Kapoor insists, if they are here, they already know. Light just gets in the way. Around 2 a.m., the sound returns, but softer, like a throat clearing in the dark. Pulses once, then stops. Max feels it in his stomach. Kapoor feels it in her spine. Neither of them moves. The air thickens, then loosens. In the morning, nothing remains. No tracks, no sound. But the pine needles near the tree have been rearranged into a spiral, tight, precise, familiar. Rollins runs the scream through a geospectral analyzer. The waveform resembles seismic activity, not earthquake, resonance, as if the sound came not from lungs, but from the ground. She maps similar scream reports across the Pacific Northwest over the last 50 years. They form a loose crescent, 1 point every decade, always remote, always near water, always in winter. Baird hypothesizes that these screams are not communication between individuals, but with the land itself. Kapoor writes, not a cry, chord, played to wake something ancient. In the archives, Max finds a 1948 report from a logging crew who abandoned a site near Kalak after several nights of choral moaning. They claimed the sound caused nausea, dizziness, and nightmares. Their supervisor described it as the trees singing in grief. None of them returned. Local authorities blamed bad meat. Rollins compares the Kalak scream with the Nahani recordings. Identical pulse signatures, same subharmonics, but layered, as if multiple beings had sung together. Not in harmony, in memory. Kapoor suggests the screams might be a form of timekeeping, markers of cycles, echoes sent forward as reminders, and maybe, just maybe, invitations. Max plays the Kalak recording one night near the bowl in Norumbega. Nothing happens, but in the morning, a pine bough has been placed in the center of the bowl. Bent, wet, fresh, not from a nearby tree, a gift, or a reply. You lie awake thinking of sounds. The ones we notice, the ones we do not. You remember moments in life when silence fell unnaturally, not because noise stopped, but because something else entered, something older. You wonder now if the scream was ever meant for us, or if we just finally learned to stand still long enough to hear it. Perhaps the scream is not a cry of pain or joy or rage. Perhaps it is a reminder that something out there remembers us and is calling us home. The descent into Pine Valley starts with a mistake. Max was tracing an old boundary line from a colonial-era map, overlaying it with Wexley's spiral coordinates, when he noticed a canyon that should not be there. Not on satellite images, not on hiking apps, but clearly marked in ink from 200 years ago. Devil's Hollow it was once called, but the name had faded from use, replaced by vague references to restricted lands and conservation zones. No official records, just absence. Rollins, Kapoor, and Max hike in mid-autumn, when the leaves are dry enough to crunch but the air still clings to warmth. The path disappears after the second mile. Animal trails take over. Then nothing. Only moss and stone and the sound of boots making decisions. They find the cave by scent before sight, a trace of iron and damp earth. The entrance is narrow, almost apologetic, but inside, the walls widen into a cathedral of silence. The first glyphs appear 12 feet in, crude, angular, yet intentional. Not writing, not art, just memory etched in stone. The symbols do not repeat, they evolve. Baird later describes them as temporal spirals, stories not meant to be read but walked past, as if meaning came from movement, not message. Deeper in, they find tools, not stone axes or spears, but shapes carved from antler and obsidian, rounded, smooth, hollowed. Tools not for hunting, for listening. One has a hole drilled through its center. When Max blows through it, it does not whistle. It vibrates. Kapoor feels it in her teeth. Rollins places a hand on the wall and says, "It is not sound. It is invitation." Further still, they find hair, old, pressed between rock layers, preserved by mineral flow. Analysis later shows the same looping mitochondrial anomaly. One marker off, still human, but not ours. At the rear of the cave, they discover a raised platform. Natural stone shaped by erosion, or by hands that knew how to guide water. Atop it, a pile of bones. Small, rodent, avian, arranged in circles, not scattered, deliberate. Kapoor notices the bones are unbroken. No signs of chewing, as if they were placed, not hunted, perhaps offerings, or messages in the language of memory. On the ceiling above the platform, a single glyph, larger than the others, a spiral with a single break. Beneath it, a handprint, too large to be human, but placed gently, not stamped in aggression, pressed like a farewell. That night, they sleep near the mouth of the cave. No fire, no tent, just layers and breath. Around 3 a.m., Max wakes to find the cave softly glowing. Not light, reflection. The moss near the entrance has become iridescent. He watches as it pulses. Once, then again, then still. Kapoor wakes and feels it too. Not fear, presence. Like someone just stepped into the room but has not spoken yet. In the morning, the glyphs seem fainter, as if they witnessed the night and chose to rest. Rollins sketches the cave layout and notes a pattern. The spiral glyphs point inward, but always toward the surface, as if the cave itself was not a retreat, but a passage, not a tomb, a door. Back at the university, they analyze the resonance of the cave's structure. Its shape amplifies subsonic frequencies perfectly, like an ancient amphitheater built not for performance, but for connection. Baird theorizes that the cave was a listening chamber, a place where the walkers came not to hide, but to hear, to align, maybe even to decide. Kapoor writes, "This was not a lair. It was a place where memory gathered." Max starts calling it the memory room. Not dramatic, just true. The data, the artifacts, the acoustics all suggest a space designed to hold more than just bodies. It held echo, and perhaps that echo was their language. Not spoken, not heard, but felt. You think about rooms like that in your own life. A basement, a library, a childhood attic. Places where time folds and silence holds a shape. You remember feeling watched, but not by eyes, by stories, waiting to be heard. The cave stays with them long after they leave. In dreams, in faint vibrations on long drives, in static that sounds like humming if you sit quietly enough. And each of them knows they were not alone in that cave. Not entirely. Something lingered. Not a being, a remembering. And maybe that is all the walkers ever wanted. To be remembered not as myths, not as mistakes, but as those who listened when the world forgot how. The accounts begin to surface quietly, tucked inside dusty newspapers and yellowed field journals, always written with caution, as if the witnesses feared being believed even more than being ignored. They do not describe monsters or beasts. They describe watchers. In 1856, a railroad surveyor in Montana writes in his ledger, "Observed a tall figure beside the ridge at dusk. It did not move. I returned its gaze. It bowed its head slightly before vanishing into the fog." In 1874, a trapper in Oregon sends a letter home, confessing he no longer sets snares near a particular grove because, as he writes, "I feel I am intruding on someone else's silence." These are not tales of aggression. They are stories of restraint, of presence, of beings who do not interfere but make their witnessing known. Max compiles dozens of such reports. He notes that none of them include violence, theft, or predation. The common thread is eye contact, a moment shared, as if the watchers were less interested in us than in seeing what we would do when we realized we were not alone. Rollins finds a photograph dated 1911. Grainy, blurred, but in the background stands a figure too tall for the slope it casts shadow upon. The foreground is sharp, Picnic, children. The figure stands like punctuation. Kapoor runs the image through light analysis software. The angle of the sun confirms the shadow is real. The figure was there, but no one in the photo reacts, as if it did not disturb them, or perhaps it was not visible to them. Baird studies the reports linguistically. She notes that the older the account, the less likely it is to use words like fear or terror. Instead, the descriptions include terms like reverence, sorrow, awe. One lumberjack wrote in 1882, "I laid my axe down when he looked at me, not out of fear, out of shame." The watcher stories cluster near logging sites, rail expansion paths, mines, as if something was monitoring our intrusion, not to stop us, to mourn us, to watch us forget what we once knew. Kapoor suggests the walkers do not intervene because intervention is not their way. They observe, not passively, but with presence. They do not halt destruction. They remember what was lost. You begin to feel it yourself. In quiet moments, looking at trees older than memory, standing in a room after someone you love has left it. The sense that something remains, not haunting, holding, as if a witness were still present. Not to judge, just to know. The oldest stories go deeper. Indigenous legends speak of those who watched the rivers form. Not gods, not spirits. Ancestors who chose the long path. The quiet one. The one that kept them whole by keeping them apart. Rollins compares these stories with Wexley's notes. He never calls them monsters. Not once. He writes, "Their eyes do not ask. They remember. They reflect." In one of his last entries, he describes looking into her gaze and seeing his mother. The first tree he ever climbed, the taste of ice on his tongue at age 6. He writes, "She did not speak, but I was heard." Kapoor begins calling them reflectors, a term that feels less mythic and more precise. Creatures who offer not information, but illumination, not messages, mirrors. Max visits the grove near the old railroad track from one of the 1850s accounts. He walks alone, carries nothing but a notebook. He does not see anything, but he writes, "For 20 minutes I felt like I was standing beside someone I had forgotten I loved." That night he dreams of, standing at the edge of a clearing. On the other side stands a figure. They do not move, they do not wave, but they do not leave. He wakes with a tear in his eye and the word stillness echoing in his chest. Baird theorizes the watchers are a kind of ancestral conscience. Not literal ancestors, but reflections of the version of us that might have been. Kapoor disagrees. She believes they are fully separate, not humans who stayed wild, but beings who never needed wildness to begin with. Rollins suggests a third option. Maybe they are what happens when memory learns how to walk. You think about all the places you have ever felt watched, not threatened, seen. The hallway outside a hospital room, a childhood backyard at dusk, a quiet hill overlooking a city you have never visited before. Perhaps those were not tricks of light. Perhaps something stood beside you, not to harm, not even to help, just to carry your moment forward into the trees. A moment remembered by someone who never needed to speak to say, "I saw you, and you were real." They call it the unclassified primate dilemma, though no one uses the phrase in academic journals. It is the term whispered in conference lobbies and behind closed lab doors when someone finds something they can't categorize but are too afraid to ignore. Kapoor hears it first from a geneticist at a closed symposium in Kyoto. He shows her a series of hair samples collected from a remote plateau in Sichuan. Each was flagged as primate anomaly, but none matched known species. Not gorilla, not orangutan, not homo. The sequences share 99% similarity with human mitochondrial DNA, but contain 3 insertions in non-coding regions that do not appear in any database. He says, "It is like someone wrote a footnote in our genome and then erased the author's name." Max collects similar anomalies from field labs in Canada, Nepal, Argentina, even Finland. Always the same pattern. Near human, not human. No match, no explanation. Rollins runs comparative morphometric models using the recovered skull and jaw data. The results produce something that does not fit anywhere on the hominin tree. The cranial capacity is too high for Australopithecus, too low for modern Homo sapiens. With facial morphology that blends traits from Neanderthals and something wholly unknown. One evolutionary biologist jokes nervously. It is like the forest made its own human, but better. Baird refuses to laugh. She says, or maybe it just made a different kind of human. One that did not need conquest to survive. The data begins to weigh on them, not because it is faulty, but because it is too consistent. Each time a sample is recovered from a remote region, it sings the same silent song, one note off from humanity, one deliberate distance away from classification. Kapoor writes a report she knows she will never publish. She titles it Homo Sylvaticus, Candidate Profile of a Divergent Lineage. In it, she outlines the argument for a hominin branch that separated not by geography but by philosophy, a species that never needed cities, fire, or words because they developed an alternate intelligence. An intelligence rooted in sensory integration, harmonic resonance, environmental memory. Not less evolved, differently evolved. Max sends the report to a contact at a European institute. A week later, they receive a polite but firm letter. Cease further inquiry. The matter is considered culturally sensitive. No explanation, no rebuttal, just silence. Rollins laughs bitterly. They know. They just do not want to admit it. The trio dubs the phenomenon the dilemma, because naming something demands an answer, and no one has one. Kapoor discovers that some of the earliest naturalists of the Enlightenment hinted at such beings. Carl Linnaeus himself once scribbled in a margin, possibly another of God's secrets left unfinished. The note was crossed out in a later edition. Baird finds an 18th century French pamphlet warning rural clergy to avoid those of the deep canopy and not mistake them for the damned, for they are only the unspoken. The word recurs again and again. Unspoken, not unspeakable, just absent from the lexicon of domination. These beings cannot be classified not because they are too strange, but because they refuse to be. They are not hidden. We simply have no drawer for them in the cabinet of our sciences. Kapoor compares the situation to dark matter, something measurable only by its effect on what we can see. And perhaps the walkers are like that. Not mythical, just not ours. Baird writes, they exist not in opposition to us, but as the unanswered question at the edge of our knowing. You begin to feel the dilemma yourself, not intellectually, emotionally. You remember people in your life who did not fit, who could not be explained, who stood at the edge of things and saw clearly. Perhaps the walkers are the oldest version of that feeling, the knowing that not all truth is measurable, that not every kin has to carry your face to carry your memory. Rollins takes a walk alone through an old-growth forest in British Columbia. She does not bring gear. She does not record anything. She just walks until she feels the stillness shift, then stops, waits, listens. Hours pass, then a breeze, a hum, and in that moment she understands. Not everything has to be proven to be present. Some truths just breathe near you. Kapoor updates the internal archive with a single line. The dilemma is not scientific. It is existential. We are not alone. We were never the only story being told. The Treaty of Shadows is not written on parchment, sealed with wax, or signed beneath banners. It exists in rumor, preserved only in a ledger from 1903 belonging to the Northwest Timber Company. Rollins discovers the document in a private collection donated by a historian's family after his death. Most of the ledger contains mundane entries, logging tallies, equipment expenses, weather reports, but one section is marked with a different hand. The paper is older, the ink lighter. The heading reads, "On the agreement with the other." Below, a description of a meeting held in the forest near Mount Shuxon between 3 company men and a figure described only as the tall one. No other names, no signatures, but the phrasing is deliberate. They asked us not to cut past the ridge. In return, we would not lose more men. Kapoor reads the sentence 3 times. That is not metaphor, she says. It is negotiation. Max traces logging records for the region in the following years. A swath of forest remained untouched for decades. Even as surrounding tracts were cleared, it was labeled structurally unstable, but geologic surveys never found fault lines. The land was simply left alone. No trails, no cabins, no timber pulled. A silence written into the economy. Baird Cross references similar patterns elsewhere. In Pennsylvania, in northern Michigan, in parts of the Carpathians, parcels of land, perfectly situated for industry, left unharvested without explanation. In one Romanian record from 1886, a forestry overseer scrawled, "Leave the tall grove. They walk." The entry was blacked out in a later copy, but the original survives. Rollins begins calling it the treaty, not legal, not verbal, a mutual understanding between those who wanted and those who remembered, an agreement of distance, not fear, respect. Kapoor wonders what terms were exchanged, what offerings were made, what gestures signaled the pact. In Wexley's journal, there is a passage about a small circle of pine cones arranged beside his tent. "When I woke," he wrote, "I found my boots placed neatly beside them, dry though it had rained all night." He never explains further, but he never returns to that valley either. Max suggests that the walkers understand our nature better than we do, that they learned long ago the value of boundaries, not fences, understanding, the spaces where coexistence depends on silence. Baird theorizes that the walkers did not sign treaties with us. They waited for us to realize which forests were not ours, the ones that watch back. You think of places you have never felt comfortable, not because they were dangerous, but because they felt occupied, not haunted, held. Forests with no trails, rooms that do not echo, roads where your footsteps feel louder than they should. Perhaps those are the spaces of the treaty, the places where the other still walks, not hiding, not hostile, simply present, and waiting for us to remember the pact. Kapoor finds a note from a 1920s park ranger in Washington. "Locals won't go past the third switchback. Say it is agreed. I do not ask." The switchback remains to this day. The trail beyond it overgrown and left off maps. Yet no landslides, no fires. The ecosystem remains pristine, as if protected not by law, but by memory. Max collects modern accounts of hikers, turning back without reason. GPS systems malfunctioning, batteries draining, a sense of wrongness at the edges of map territory. Not paranormal, practical, a modern enforcement of an old agreement. The treaty is not about proof. It is about posture, knowing where you are no longer the center of the story. Rollins writes, "To honor the treaty is not to acknowledge what lives beyond the trees. It is to acknowledge that it was never waiting for our acknowledgement in the first place." You sit alone, thinking of places you once passed quickly, uncomfortably. Perhaps you were being asked to pause, or to turn back, not for your safety, but for theirs. The treaty still holds, because some silences are sacred, because not all land is meant to be owned, because in a world of noise, the most respectful act is to step lightly, and leave no echo. It is easy to believe that the forest chose its guardians based on strength, stealth, or silence, but Rollins begins to suspect the truth is far more human. The idea begins with a passage from Wexley, one that stands out from his scientific notations and terrain sketches. He writes, "She touched the tree with such care, I thought she might cry. There was grief in her stillness, not instinct." The line lingers in Kapoor's mind for days. She pores over it again and again, until she finally writes in her notes, "What if they chose exile not out of fear, but heartbreak?" The hypothesis is radical, proposes that the ancestors who became the walkers did not simply leave civilization behind for survival or ecological harmony. They left because something broke inside them. Not bones, trust, community, love. Max gathers folk stories passed between tribes, whispers from old logging towns, memories traded under stars. Many describe the same thing, a sadness in the eyes, a gentle turning away, One Appalachian tale tells of a giant who once sat at the edge of town every winter, never entering, only watching the smoke rise from chimneys. He was not hunting, the storyteller said. He was remembering. In Siberia, a woman tells of an elder who vanished into the forest after losing his family, returning only once, years later, silent and covered in moss, as if the trees had raised him. Kapoor begins connecting the emotional tone across accounts. There is little rage, no vengeance, only withdrawal, a slow, mournful distance, as if the walkers chose solitude not for power, but because they had no more to give. Baird suggests a new framework, that perhaps the walkers are not another species, but another answer to the question of how to bear being alive. They grieve, they listen, they do not build monuments, but they leave pine cones in spirals. They do not speak, but their silence hums with knowing. You start to remember the moments when you too walked away, from noise, from pain, from people who did not see you. What if that instinct to leave is ancient? What if the part of you that wanted to vanish into trees was never a weakness, just a calling? Kapoor finds a recording from the 1980s. A woman hiking alone captured what she thought were birdsong. But in the background, there is a low tone, like humming through a hollow chest. The woman speaks softly into the recorder. I do not think they want to hurt us. I think they just do not want to hurt anymore. That night, Kapoor can't sleep. She thinks of how many species choose isolation when wounded, of how even humans seek quiet when their hearts are broken. Perhaps the walkers were simply the first to understand that civilization asks too much of those who feel too deeply. Rollins writes, we have assumed their silence means less. But what if it means more? What if they are not behind us in evolution but ahead, choosing peace over presence, witnessing instead of wounding? Max visits the old cave again, this time alone. He carries no tools, just a pine cone. He places it on the platform at the back. Waits, says nothing. That night, he dreams of his sister, who died when they were young. She stands at the edge of the forest, not speaking, just watching. And behind her, tall figures wait, not in menace, in mourning. He wakes with tears on his face and the memory of a warm hand on his shoulder. The next morning, the pine cone is gone. You think of every creature that chose not to stay, every friend who grew quiet, every stranger who vanished from your life without warning. Maybe they were not escaping. Maybe they were becoming something else, something softer. The walkers might not be monsters or ancestors or relics. They might be heartbreak with feet, memory that chose moss over metal, kin who loved too much to stay near the noise. And when they leave offerings in the dark, they are not warnings. They are reminders that even silence comes from somewhere, that even solitude has a heartbeat, and that perhaps the deepest intelligence is knowing when to step away, not out of fear, but love. It starts with the birds, not their absence but their precision. In areas known for sightings and spiral markings, avian patterns shift in ways too consistent to be random. Kapoor notices it during her third visit to Pine Valley. She is taking notes on lichen spread when a flock of jays swoops low in absolute silence, circles once, and lands near the same cairn they saw last spring. The birds do not call, do not peck. They simply sit, facing the same direction, waiting. She watches for 9 minutes before they all take off in unison, heading north. She marks the moment in her journal. Doesn't mention it until weeks later, when Rollins finds a pattern in archived wildlife surveys. Nesting changes in owl populations, lower than expected migration loops, anomalous flock shapes on radar, all clustered in regions that overlap with spiral formations and anomalous prints. Max jokes maybe they are birdwatchers too, but Kapoor grows serious. Or maybe the birds remember them. Baird begins digging into ornithological folklore. In several traditions, birds are described as messengers between worlds, not metaphorically, literally. She finds a Cree legend where ravens follow the quiet ones and carry their sorrows skyward. In Nepal, shamans speak of mountain spirits who teach birds where not to sing. The more she reads, the more the link emerges. Birds do not fear the walkers. They adapt around them. They change. They participate. Rollins finds a field note from Wexley describing a night where birds mimicked his camp whistle for hours, but only after she appeared at the tree line. He writes it was as if she tuned them, as if their voices mirrored her intention. Kapoor installs trail cams near known spiral sites and reviews dozens of hours of footage. In 2 locations, birds appear in repeating intervals. Every morning, before sunrise, perch, wait, leave, always the same branch, always the same angle. She places a pressure sensor beneath the branch. One morning it activates, but no bird is visible, only the wind. For just a second, she writes in her notes, birds know. Max contacts a researcher in Peru studying songbird adaptation. He shares data showing isolated populations of tanagers incorporating subsonic tones into mating calls. Tones too low for typical avian function. The calls are longer, slower, resonant, and they occur only in uninhabited valleys. You begin to wonder if the forest communicates not through speech but through echo, through those who pass between branches and carry signals on feathers. Perhaps the walkers do not speak to birds. Perhaps birds sing in languages we forgot. Baird proposes the idea of environmental harmonics, the theory that memory can be distributed across species, not in genes, in behaviors, that animals, especially birds, record patterns into their habits like etchings in wind. Kapoor calls it avian resonance, a form of data storage not made of zeros, but instincts. In that framework, birds become the stewards of presence. They remember where the watchers walked. They adjust accordingly. They participate in silence. They become part of the treaty. Max visits a crow roost near an old spiral site. He walks through quietly, does not record anything, but he leaves a shell, a stone, and a pine needle in a triangle. The next day, all 3 items are gone, replaced with a single feather. White, not from any crow. He keeps it pinned inside his notebook. Doesn't tell the others. You think now about birds that seem to watch you a second too long. A hawk circling once. A sparrow landing beside you on an empty bench. Perhaps you were being catalogued, or acknowledged, not by the bird, by something behind it. You realize the walkers may not be alone. They may be in a network, not digital, natural, a chorus without sound, an ecology of awareness. And in that system, the birds are their eyes, their messengers, their songs. Perhaps the next time a bird sings near you at dawn, you will pause. You will listen not just to the melody, but to the silence around it. Because in that stillness, something older may be waiting to be heard. Not by your ears, but by the part of you that remembers how to listen without needing to know why. They do not plan the meeting. It just happens. After months of tracking spirals, glyphs, hair samples, and resonance sites, Max finds himself deep in the Black Hills. Not on assignment, not for research, but because he needed silence. Real silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. He leaves his gear behind on the 3rd day. No camera, no sensor, just a tin flask and a notebook. The air is cold. The trail has long disappeared, but the forest does not feel wild. Feels waiting. At sunset, he reaches a clearing shaped like a bowl. Pine needles line the floor in an unnatural pattern, not random, curved inward, as if something had sat there often enough to teach the forest its rhythm. He stands at the edge, doesn't enter, just waits. After a while, he hears it. A branch bending, not breaking, then a second, then silence again. He does not move. He does not call out. Then it appears, not from the trees, from the stillness, as if shaped from shadow. The figure is taller than any human, broad as a bear but straighter in posture, fur draped in moss, eyes neither glowing nor dark, just there. The gaze is not challenging. It is present, like looking into someone who has known you longer than you have known yourself. Max swallows but does not run. He steps forward, slow, steady. The figure does not move. Then, from behind, a second form appears. Smaller, quieter, pair. As in the legends, as in the glyphs, they do not speak, but something passes between them and Max. A gaze, a shared breath. Then one of them crouches slowly and picks up a pine cone, places it in the center of the bowl, then steps back. Max understands without knowing why. He kneels beside the pine cone, places his hand over it, waits. The air changes, like wind underwater. Everything stills. Then a soft hum rises, not from the creatures, from the forest itself. As if in acknowledgement, Max does not record. He does not blink. They stay like that until dusk becomes night. Then the figures turn, not quickly, not fearfully, and walk back into the woods. Not vanishing, departing, like smoke that chooses to dissipate. Max sleeps in the clearing. No fire, no fear. In the morning, the pine cone is gone. In its place is a circle of bird feathers, arranged clockwise. Some crow, some jay, one white. He leaves them untouched, walks back without marking his trail. When he returns, he tells Rollins and Kapoor only this: "We were both listening. That was enough." He writes no paper, submits no findings, only sketches what he remembers in his notebook, then places it on a shelf and never opens it again. Kapoor cries when she hears, not out of fear, but out of knowing it will never happen again. Not like that, not to her. And yet, that night, she dreams of sitting beside a creature who says nothing but whose breath matches hers perfectly. They look over a river that moves without sound. When she wakes, her pillow is damp with tears and pine needles rest on the windowsill, though the window was shut. Rollins stops looking for answers. She begins writing fiction again. A short story about a child who learns to hear trees whisper. Not with ears, with bones. Baird leaves a note on her desk. It happened. That is enough. You wonder now if your own meeting is waiting. Not dramatic, not mythical, just near. Perhaps it will come when you walk without purpose, when you breathe without thought, when you stop asking and simply listen. Maybe it will not happen in the forest at all. Maybe it will be in a moment of absolute stillness between your footsteps on a familiar street. A shape at the edge of your vision. A gaze from a stranger that lingers a half-second longer than it should. The walkers do not demand. They do not teach. They do not convert. They wait. And when you are quiet enough, broken enough, or whole enough, they meet you, not to prove they exist, but to remind you that you do, and that you always have. The last one does not leave. He does not melt back into the forest or vanish into legend. He stays, quiet, watchful, human, at least on the outside. His name, if he gave one, was Elias, first appearing in census records from 1921, listed as a field hand in Oregon, though no family preceded or followed him. The paper trail is thin, almost hesitant. A schoolteacher recalls him as a boy who rarely spoke but could mimic bird calls with eerie accuracy. A woman in Idaho remembers him carving spirals into bark with his fingers alone. An old miner swears Elias saved him from a collapsed shaft, pulling him out with inhuman strength. But when help arrived, Elias was gone. He reappears a few years later working in a sawmill, never requesting pay, living in a shack without light. They say he read by moonlight, spoke only when necessary, smiled like a tree might if it had lips. The locals assumed he was simple, or strange, but never dangerous. One autumn, he walked into town barefoot, carrying a small pine cone wrapped in cloth. He left it on the preacher's steps and walked away. The preacher planted it, and to this day, the tree that grew there refuses to die. Rollins finds fragments of his story buried in census anomalies and folklore newsletters. She becomes obsessed. A man who aged slower than his peers, who was never seen eating, who never married, who once stood perfectly still in the woods for 3 days while researchers walked past him again and again, thinking he was a burnt stump. Kapoor reads a story of him from a nurse in 1967. She said he sat with dying patients who had no family, never spoke, just placed a hand on the bed and stayed until their last breath. Then left a feather behind, always a white one, Baird uncovers a poem attributed to a drifter in 1983. It ends with the line, "The one who stayed knows everything, but asks nothing." Max begins to believe Elias was not just a walker among us. He was the bridge, the final echo, the one who stepped fully into our world not to reveal a secret, but to carry it quietly, to witness our forgetting and forgive it. Perhaps the others sent him, or perhaps he volunteered, not out of duty, out of love, a being born of silence choosing to live among noise, not to change it, just to endure it. You feel him now in memories you did not know were shared, in the stranger who looked at you kindly on the worst day of your life, in the hiker who showed you the way back when your trail disappeared, in the old man who sat beside you at the funeral and said nothing but made you feel less alone. Elias is not legend. He is possibility, that somewhere, among all our chaos and clamor, someone remembers the forest not as a place, but as home, and carries that memory into every step, every touch, every still moment that holds more meaning than words ever could. He might still be out there, watching, not to be seen, but to see, not to return, because he never left. Maybe he is walking beside you now, barefoot, silent, carrying the pine cone of your oldest sorrow. And maybe one day you will stop long enough for him to place it gently into your hand. And in that moment, you will understand, not with your mind, but with your marrow, that we were never alone, that we were never forgotten, that the forest remembers us too. As the echoes of the forest grow softer, let your breath follow their rhythm, slow, gentle, rooted like the moss that never hurries to grow. You have walked far tonight, through spirals and silence, through stories buried beneath pine needles and memory. The walkers are no longer strangers, not monsters, not mysteries, just a quieter truth, a truth that hums beneath your ribs and waits for stillness to be heard. Let their gaze fade now, like fog lifting from a forest floor. Let their footprints dissolve into earth, not as absence but as invitation. The trees no longer whisper because they know you are listening. The birds pause their songs because they know you remember. And Elias, the one who stayed, smiles softly from a memory you never made, reminding you that some journeys do not end. They return, in dreams, in wind, in the hush just before sleep. So release now. Let your mind step away from questions. Let your thoughts drift into the spiral of rest. There is nothing left to chase. You are safe. You are held. And somewhere, deep in the woods where the stars fall slow, someone is still listening for you.